The hammer rose and fell again and again, echoing through the dim-lit workshop of Camp Aliceville, Alabama, in the winter of 1944. The clang of metal on metal rang like a challenge. 6 German engineers, prisoners of war from the Africa Corps, stood around a wooden table where a small block of dull silver alloy lay. Oberingenieur Karl Voss, once a senior metallurgist at Krupp, gripped the handle of a 5-kilogram sledgehammer. His jaw was set, his pride sharper than the steel he used to forge. When the blow landed, the Americans watching barely flinched. The metal didn't bend. It didn't even scar. Voss struck again and again, sweat darkened his collar. Around him, the other prisoners whispered disbelief. One muttered, "Das ist unmöglich." Another scoffed, too quickly, too loudly, trying to mask his unease. When the foreman, Sergeant Harold Lasky, nodded for them to stop, Voss leaned in and ran a gloved hand across the surface. Smooth, untouched. He couldn't hide the tremor in his fingers. The Americans called it alloy 24th, a common material used in P-47 wings and B-29 fuselages. To the Germans, it might as well have been alchemy. In Essen, Berlin, and Schweinfurt, they had struggled to find alloys that wouldn't crack under vibration. Here, in a dusty southern camp built between peanut fields and pine forests, they found a metal that refused to break. That evening, under the weak light of a single bulb, the men argued in the barracks. Voss stared at his notebook, filled with sketches of crystalline structures and fatigue charts. "It should have fractured," he murmured. Beside him, Hans Reiter, a younger engineer from Hanover, said, "If this is what they build planes from, we never stood a chance." Someone laughed bitterly, not at America, but at themselves. Outside, the night hummed with crickets and distant trains carrying war supplies eastward. The prisoners could see the faint glow of factory lights beyond the horizon, like a second moon. Voss thought of the laboratories in Germany, cold, dark, starving for coal, and realized that the Reich's might had been built on brittle pride. He wrote a single sentence in his hidden diary: "Their metal endures the hammer, ours endures only our illusions." That line would stay with him for years, because that night, every clang of the hammer became more than sound. It was revelation. If a single block of American alloy could withstand such punishment, what else in this country refused to break? Its factories, its people, its belief that progress belonged to everyone, not a chosen few. Outside, the workshop cooled, but in Voss's mind, something had begun to melt. The certainty of superiority, the faith that Germany's science had no rival. Beneath the dim light, he could almost see it. The thin silver block, unbroken, gleaming quietly like the mirror of an idea he could no longer ignore. If this metal cannot break, he thought, perhaps neither can they. By the spring of 1944, word had spread through the POW camps of the American alloy that refused to break. The Germans called it Teufelsmetall, devil's metal, but what unsettled them most was not its strength. It was its origin. Inside a fenced depot near Mobile, Alabama, a group of captured engineers gathered around crates of dull silver scrap metal. A U.S. Army technician, Private First Class Leon McCarthy, explained through an interpreter that the alloy samples they had tested came from recycled civilian waste. "Old bicycles, kitchen pots, soda cans," he said, grinning, "even washing machines." The Germans exchanged skeptical glances. Surely he was joking. He wasn't. Across the United States, more than 80 million citizens were collecting metal for the war effort. School children filled wagons with tin foil and broken toys. Housewives donated pots and pans. By 1943, the government had gathered over 1 million tons of scrap aluminum, melted it down, and transformed it into alloy 2024 T3, the backbone of the B-29 superfortress. The junk of everyday America had become the strategic heart of its air fleet. Hauptingenieur Karl Voss studied one ingot carefully. The surface was marked with faint streaks, remnants of its recycled life. He couldn't believe it. In Germany, raw bauxite was scarce, carefully guarded, refined with precision. The idea that a nation could throw household scrap into a furnace and produce something stronger than Krupp steel seemed absurd, and yet here it was, gleaming quietly in his hands. That night, in the barracks, they argued again. "It's propaganda," said one. "Impossible," said another. But Reiter, the younger one, pointed out the obvious. They have scale, millions of homes feeding their furnaces, while ours starve. In the following weeks, they were allowed to assist in maintenance work at the depot. Every day, they saw trucks arriving with barrels labeled aluminum drive. The labels bore names of schools, churches, even women's clubs. The prisoners began to grasp a terrifying truth. America's power was not in secret formulas, but in ordinary people acting together. Voss wrote another line in his notebook. They smelt patriotism into metal. He began comparing tensile strength figures. The recycled alloy held 72,000 psi, rivaling German duralumin produced under strict laboratory controls. It wasn't the chemistry that humbled him. It was the democracy of it. While German science was bound to hierarchy and control, America had turned citizens into contributors of strength. On a humid evening, as thunder rolled over the Gulf, Voss looked at the glowing furnaces and thought of the Reich's propaganda posters declaring, "Steel is victory." He realized how wrong they were. Steel could be forged by anyone, but willpower, unity, and imagination could only be forged by a free people. The revelation came quietly, like the hiss of molten metal poured into a mold. The metal that once belonged to bicycles and kitchen pots now carried bombers over Berlin. Junk had outsmarted science. And Voss, for the first time, wondered whether the true miracle of America was not its machines, but its people. They arrived at the Alcoa plant in Tennessee on a gray morning in July 1944. The air smelled of heat and river mist, the Tennessee Valley Authority's hydroelectric hum feeding the lifeblood of American industry. To the German engineers from Camp Aliceville, this was not a factory. It was a cathedral made of flame. The guards allowed them to stand at the edge of the casting bay, where molten aluminum flowed like sunrise through steel troughs. Before them, a furnace the size of a locomotive roared without pause. A shift supervisor, a man named Edward Eddie Brewer, shouted above the din, "This furnace hasn't gone cold in 1,000 days." The Germans thought he exaggerated, until he showed them the logbook. Every line, every signature proved the claim. Since March 1942, the smelter had run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, producing hundreds of tons of alloy each day for the wings and fuselages of America's heavy bombers. Hauptingenieur Karl Voss felt the heat prickle his face. He imagined the furnaces back home in Essen, often silent for lack of coal, their workers hungry and exhausted. Here, men and women worked in rotating shifts, eating sandwiches near the vats, laughing, shouting over the roar, the rhythm of an economy that refused to rest. One of the Americans offered them coffee in tin mugs. The taste was strong, bitter, alive. Hans Reiter whispered, "Even their breaks smell like energy." A foreman opened a steel hatch, revealing the liquid light inside. The temperature read 1,350 degrees C, yet the workers moved with casual precision. Sparks danced across the concrete floor like fireflies. Voss took notes mechanically, but inside he felt something breaking. Not his pride in engineering, but his belief in Germany's invincibility. Everywhere he looked, he saw motion. Cranes swinging, conveyors rattling, ingots cooling on endless racks. Each one was stamped, made by Alcoa, Tennessee Works. He tried to count them, gave up after the first 100. When he asked how they sustained production, Brewer simply replied, "We never turn the fire off, not once." That night, in their quarters near the plant, the Germans couldn't sleep. Through the window, the horizon glowed orange. The reflection of the smelter flames against the low clouds, it looked like dawn, even at midnight. Voss opened his diary and wrote, "They live by the rhythm of their furnaces. When ours die, theirs awaken. When our lights dim, theirs burn brighter." He remembered the phrase from an American poster he'd seen at the depot: "Keep the furnaces burning for victory." It wasn't propaganda, it was literal truth. By morning, he realized something deeper. America's advantage was not the alloy, nor the machinery. It was this: an unbroken chain of effort, an industrial heartbeat that never slept. As the train took them back to camp, the glow of the Alcoa plant faded behind the hills. But to Voss, it looked less like fire and more like faith. The next visit was to a foundry outside Marietta, Georgia, where aircraft components for the P-47 Thunderbolt were being poured. The prisoners expected to see foremen barking orders, perhaps rows of uniformed men at the furnaces. Instead, they stopped short. Every crane, every lathe, every welding torch was operated by women. The air shimmered with heat and rhythm, chains rattled, a molten stream of aluminum hissed into molds. A young woman with soot on her cheeks adjusted the crucible flow with calm precision. Her badge read Ruth M. Carson, Crane Operator, Shift B. She guided several tons of molten alloy into waiting casts as effortlessly as a violinist guiding a bow. Karl Voss felt his throat tighten. In Essen, no woman had ever set foot inside a metallurgical workshop. Here, they ran the floor. He saw two of them laughing between shifts, one handing the other a coffee from a dented thermos. It wasn't spectacle, it was routine. Competence born of necessity. An American supervisor told them nearly 6 million women now worked in war production. 1 in every 3 factory workers was female. At Alcoa alone, 30% of smelter crews were women, many from farming towns or former school teachers. Their hands were scarred, their nails blackened, but their eyes were steady. Voss scribbled furiously in his notebook. Hans Reiter stood beside him, silent. "In our country," Voss murmured, "they'd call this blasphemy." Reiter answered, "Maybe that's why we're losing." Later that day, they were shown the testing lab. 2 women in goggles examined tensile samples, logging results on clipboards. One greeted them with a polite, "Good afternoon, gentlemen," before striking the switch that snapped a bar in half, recording the exact load at failure. The Germans noted the result, 73,500 psi. Another piece of scrap-borne alloy outperforming the best German formulations. As the afternoon light filtered through the high windows, Ruth wiped her hands on a rag and looked at the prisoners. "My husband's in France," she said softly, "so I build his wings here." None of the men replied. There was nothing to say. That evening, back in the barracks, they spoke little. The clang of the foundry still echoed in their minds. Voss wrote, "Their women forge wings while ours forge silence." For the first time, he saw that the secret behind American metal wasn't chemistry or wealth. It was inclusion. The belief that every capable hand, regardless of gender, could feed the nation's strength. When lights went out, Reiter whispered into the dark, "If knowledge and equality are part of their alloy, no weapon can defeat that." Outside, the furnaces flared again, painting the sky in gold and crimson. To the men behind barbed wire, it looked like the dawn of a world where strength had a new face, and it was covered in soot. The news came 2 weeks later. A P-47 Thunderbolt had gone down near Birmingham. The aircraft, returning from a test flight, lost altitude after engine trouble and crashed in a field. No one expected the German engineers to be allowed near the wreck, but an American officer, Captain Reynolds, summoned them anyway. "You men know metal," he said. "Maybe you'll learn something from ours." They rode in a military truck under a scorching July sun, the landscape blurring past. Cotton fields, barns, winding roads. When they reached the crash site, the smell of burned oil hung heavy in the air. The fighter's carcass lay torn but not destroyed, its fuselage half buried in mud. Karl Voss crouched beside a fragment of the wing root. The metal had folded inward like softened bread dough. He touched the surface, rippled, not shattered. The alloy had bent, not broken. "It absorbed the impact," murmured Hans Reiter. He picked up a smaller shard, its edges curled, glinting like pewter under sunlight. Even in death, it fought to hold itself together. An American mechanic explained that the pilot survived with a broken arm. The Germans stared at him in disbelief. The frame of the P-47 had acted like a shield. In their designs, failure came suddenly, catastrophic, clean, absolute. Here, failure came with mercy. Voss remembered the stress-strain curves he had drawn years earlier in Essen, showing the brittle limits of German duralumin. This metal rewrote those curves entirely. "It's like a living thing," he whispered. "It refuses to die." Captain Reynolds handed him a small section of the wing. "Keep it," he said. "Call it a souvenir." Voss hesitated before slipping the piece into his pocket. That night, under the weak bulb of the barracks, he placed it on the table. Its surface caught the light like a mirror. Around him, the men stared silently. One prisoner broke the stillness. "Even their metal has a soul." Another muttered, "And ours perhaps never did." The camp grew quiet, except for the hum of the generators. Beyond the wire, the southern night breathed with heat and crickets. Voss ran a thumb along the bent alloy, thinking of the ruined cities back home: Cologne, Hamburg, Essen, each collapsing like glass under strain. In that twisted wing fragment, he saw a symbol far larger than metallurgy. It was a portrait of endurance, a culture that flexed, adapted, absorbed pressure, yet refused to snap. The same spirit he had glimpsed in the women at the furnaces, the workers at the smelters, the farmers sending scrap to war. He thought of a phrase he had read in an English manual: "Ductility is resilience." Now he understood. The real secret of American strength wasn't in its formulas. It was in its character. And as the lights flickered out, he whispered to himself, almost reverently, "Even when they fall unbroken." Autumn arrived with rain that turned the Alabama soil into red clay. Inside the camp workshop, the German engineers continued cataloging samples from American aircraft wreckage, tasks meant to occupy their minds, but which, for men like Karl Voss, had become an obsession. One evening, under the dull light of a single lamp, Voss examined a small alloy panel from the same P-47 crash they'd studied weeks earlier. Near the edge, faintly stamped into the metal, he saw a code, 24SDT. At first he thought it a serial number, but the engineer in him couldn't let it go. He asked an American guard for a manual, pretending to be curious about maintenance logs. A week later, through a translator, a U.S. technician explained, almost casually, "That's the federal standard for aircraft aluminum. It tells you how it was heat-treated, tempered, and stress-tested. Every plane, every part follows the same code." Voss froze. Every part. In Germany, each factory had its own formulas, its own traditions, its own secrecy. One plant in Kassel used a different alloy from another in Augsburg. There was no single language of metal, but here, across an entire continent, every bolt, every wing, every rivet spoke the same dialect. He wrote furiously in his notebook, "They win not by genius, but by system. Every worker speaks through the same code." Hans Reiter joined him later, looking over the notes. "It's like they removed chance itself," he said. Voss nodded slowly. "No, Hans, they replaced it with order." The next day, Captain Reynolds arranged a visit to an air depot near Montgomery, where thousands of replacement parts were stacked in labeled crates. 24SDT rivet stock, alclad panels, standard issue, federal specification. A young American metallurgist named John Miller, barely 25, proudly explained that over 12,000 factories used the same manuals printed by the Bureau of Standards. Doesn't matter if it's Kansas or California, same metal, same measurements, same results. Voss felt a quiet awe. This was no empire built on obedience, but on coordination. In the Reich, efficiency meant fear. Here, it meant trust. Every worker confident the next man would follow the same blueprint. That night, back in the barracks, the men debated fiercely. One prisoner said, "It's soulless. They replaced craftsmanship with uniformity." Reiter shook his head. No, they built a language that everyone understands. That's not soulless. That's civilization. Outside, thunder rolled over the pines. Voss lay awake, the rain tapping the tin roof like Morse code. The letters on that metal haunted him, 24 TT. To the untrained eye, meaningless. But to him, they were the signature of a nation that had mastered continuity. He closed his eyes and saw it clearly. An invisible network connecting every forge, every worker, every mind across oceans and states. It wasn't brilliance that made America unstoppable. It was unity hidden inside the alloy itself. A code not of atoms, but of purpose. The war was ending. By May 1945, Camp Aliceville began preparing for repatriation. The guards smiled more often now, and the prisoners received Red Cross letters from home. Some filled with joy, others with silence. For the German engineers, those final weeks felt like standing between two worlds, the one they had lost and the one they had just begun to understand. Karl Voss sat at a wooden desk in the camp library, a half-finished letter before him. The paper smelled faintly of coal dust and pine. He wrote slowly, every line heavier than the last. We studied metallurgy to make weapons. They study it to build a world. We forged to conquer. They forge to endure. Around him, men packed their belongings. Small carvings, notebooks, the odd keepsake of captivity. Hans Reiter approached, holding a piece of alloy wrapped in cloth, the bent fragment from the P-47 wing. "Take it home," he said. "You'll need a reminder." Voss smiled faintly. "No," he answered. "It belongs to history now." He placed it on the shelf above his bunk, where the morning sun would catch its silver curve. Each day, more prisoners were sent north to New York for embarkation. The Americans provided them with fresh clothes, ration packs, even chocolate. The same soldiers who once guarded them now shook their hands. That quiet generosity unnerved some, softened others. Before departure, Captain Reynolds visited the engineers one last time. "You men are going home to rebuild," he said. "Take what you've learned here, not the blueprints, but the spirit." None of them replied, but all understood. The train journey north cut through a land of light. Factories still glowing, rivers turning turbines, children waving from platforms. Every mile was a lesson in resilience. Voss looked out the window and thought of the furnaces of Tennessee, the women forging wings, the endless code engraved into metal, all of it humming with one principle, of faith in creation, not destruction. He imagined post-war Germany, hollow, hungry, desperate for raw materials. He wondered if they could ever replicate what he had seen here, not the machinery, but the freedom that powered it. At sea, aboard the Liberty ship taking them home, he finished his letter to Hanover. "Tell them the secret isn't the alloy. It's the fire that never goes out, the laughter of workers who believe in tomorrow, the women who pour light into molds. Tell them America's strength lies not in the furnace, but in the hearts that feed it." He sealed it, tucked it between the pages of his notebook, and stared at the Atlantic horizon. The sunset reflected off the waves like molten aluminum, red, gold, unbroken. When the ship's lights flickered on, he caught his own reflection in the glass, older, humbled, but somehow lighter. The man who had once sworn that German metal ruled the world now knew better. The strongest alloy was not forged in heat alone. It was made of dignity, curiosity, and compassion. Years later, long after the war had faded into textbooks and parades, Karl Voss would sometimes wake in the middle of the night and swear he could still hear the hum of the Tennessee furnaces. In his small workshop outside Hanover, he kept a single keepsake, a fragment of aluminum, smooth and curved, the color of quiet light. He never told his apprentices where it came from. He simply said, "This metal taught me respect." In 1952, when West German factories began producing aircraft again under Allied supervision, many of the returning engineers had once been POWs in America. Their designs carried traces of what they had seen: lighter alloys, standardized parts, a new humility in process. Germany's rebirth was not born of imitation, but of understanding. The men who once mocked American methods now taught them, Sometimes, when the evening shift ended, Voss would walk past the cooling furnaces and smell that same mingling of oil and ozone, the same scent that filled the Alabama air in 1944. He would remember the women pouring molten light into molds, the unbroken wing, the letters 24STT stamped like a code of civilization. Those memories didn't haunt him. They anchored him. He had learned that true strength isn't hardness. It's endurance. It isn't domination. It's creation. What America had revealed to him wasn't just superior metal, but a moral alloy. Freedom mixed with purpose. Precision joined with compassion. It was a discovery as much spiritual as technical. In his later years, Voss told his students, "Metallurgy is the study of failure. Every fracture tells a story." Then he would pause, eyes distant, and add, "But sometimes, if you listen closely, you can also hear the story of what refused to break. The world rebuilt itself from the ashes of that war, shaped by hands that once wielded hammers in hatred, now forging in hope. The furnaces burned again, not for conquest, but for continuity." As night settled over Hanover, the glow of the factory lights shimmered in the river below, reflections of a lesson learned long ago in captivity, that even in defeat, understanding can be victory. And somewhere across the ocean, the American foundries still roared, their flames whispering the same truth the German engineers had once discovered with trembling hands. Strength, in the end, is not about what resists the hammer, it's about what survives it.